Good evening. We're going to look at Proverbs and money. It's quite a challenging topic. I reckon there's probably at least 50, if not more, Proverbs that cover money. So we've got quite a challenging topic, but I'm going to try my best. For many years I was a senior leader in schools, and so that often involved me doing lesson observations. And sometimes you'd walk into a lesson and your breath would be taken away because what you saw was just unbelievable practice. You would see this amazing teacher practitioner and kids buzzing with learning, and just walking into the classroom was just like you were on holy ground. It was just amazing. And the opposite was true as well. And you didn't always see that. But then you would critique the lesson and then you would talk to the teacher. But my mantra was always, when you walk out of my office, I want you to walk out being a better teacher than when you walked in. But what I found myself constantly saying over and over again to teachers is, why are you working harder than the kids? That'd be what I'd be saying all the time. Why are you working harder than the kids? Yeah, you should work hard when you plan your lesson, but when you walk in, you should just step back, light the fire, and let it go. And so I'm going to take that advice this evening. So you're going to work much harder than me, is where I'm going with this. I'm going to share a few thoughts. And then you're going to have 3 opportunities around your tables to discuss some questions that I've put together to get you thinking. But as we go through Proverbs, if we go to the next slide, I'd like us to think about these 3 things, because when it comes to money, I think there are 3 important questions. One is how you get money. The other is what you do with money, which is partly what Duncan was sharing. But then the third one, which I think is equally important, is what does money do to you? So as we're thinking about Proverbs, I want us to think about those 3 things. Where does your money come from? What do you do with it? And then what does money do to you? So next slide. But as Alison's alluded, it's worth bearing this in mind before we begin, that Proverbs 22 verse 2 says, rich and poor have this in common, the Lord is their maker. And I guess one of the things as Christians is we just have a different value set to the world. And when you become a Christian, what God has to do is he has to unpick the previous value system that you had and change it so that it's in line with the kingdom of God. And one of the most important things about the kingdom of God is that our value is born out of this one fact, that you are bought by the blood of Christ. So value is not something to be found in jobs or money or in status. Value is found when you realize that you're bought by the blood of Christ. That can't change. It doesn't matter if you become the holiest person that ever walks the earth, you are no more valuable to God than the moment in which you got saved. Because it's not what you do and how you conduct yourself, though God is calling us to live holy lives. But if you live the holiest life ever, you have no more value to God than when you first got saved, because it is the blood of Christ. So we need to sort of fight against that value system out there that says that if you're wealthy, if you're good looking, if you're, incredibly successful at work, you're of more value. So please bear that in mind. So how you get work, how you get sort of money. Well, Proverbs is an interesting book, because Proverbs makes a very clear link between hard work and wealth. And what you find is, as you go through Proverbs, you actually don't find that Proverbs is particularly down on wealth. You actually find that Proverbs is quite positive about wealth. which is worth thinking about in itself. But part of it is, it's how you get it that is the issue, first of all. So Proverbs 10 verse 4 and 5 says, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. He who gathers crops in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son. So you have this kind of, first of all, this concept in Proverbs, which is an interesting starting point, that wealth in itself per se is a neutral thing. It's neither good nor bad. It's really about where you get it from that is important. Let's see the next slide. And Ephesians, so it's not just an Old Testament concept. Ephesians is saying the same. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. So that's partly, the latter part is towards the end. It's actually what you do with it. It's about sharing it. Now, Proverbs deals a lot with poverty, and it does make a clear link between poverty and laziness, as it makes a clear link between wealth and hard work. Now, it's not that simple, and this is why we just don't have enough time to unpick this, because Proverbs does talk about significant other reasons why people experience poverty. So it's not all about laziness. So there's, Proverbs talks about greed, that it's a source of poverty, that people that have money are self-obsessed and have a disregard for other people. So it's not simply that poverty is about laziness. We know that it's much more nuanced than that. We know it's much more multifaceted than that. But what's important is that it says in Proverbs, such are the paths of all those who go after ill-gotten gain. And I think this is such an important thing. It takes away the life of those who get it. In other words, if you're serving money, it will take away your life. And Jesus said the same. You can't serve both God and money. Those things are important. So it's about, that word serving is important. We haven't yet come across anything that says having wealth per se is a bad thing. But we have looked at something that says getting it the wrong way is particularly unhelpful. So there is something that, and the church has been at the forefront of encouraging a work ethic, about working hard and honestly. And those are things that you often don't hear in churches anymore. People saying, that it's okay to work hard as long as you're pursuing it in an honest way. So just some initial thoughts. So here's your first table discussion. What does a healthy view of hard work look like? And what about people that have got 3 jobs? You've got 7.4 minutes, which is 7 minutes and 24 seconds if you want me to define it for you. Off you go. Okay, we're going to draw that bit to an end. I realise that wasn't 7:24. If you actually set a timer, I hope nobody did. You need to see me at the end. So next slide. So Proverbs talks about where money comes from and how you get it. And then it talks about what you do with it. And generally speaking, Proverbs is very passionate about generosity, about the need, about meeting other needs. And that's, again, a very different kind of concept to the world's concept, which is very much about having worked hard to get it, it's mine. And because it's mine, I've got the right to do with it what I want. Whereas Proverbs is advocating generosity. So, In 22 verse 9 it says, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Those who give to the poor will lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to them will receive many curses. And this is reinforced in the New Testament again, if you look at the next slide. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in them? And what the New Testament is saying is that generosity is actually one of the marks of love. You know, that you can say that you love people. And actually Christians can say lots of things. But the proof of a Christian is not so much in what they say, it's in their behaviour. That's true of all people. You know, we can all say the right things and behave in a certain way. But if you really want to know what a person's values are, I would suggest that you stop listening to their words and start watching their behaviour. Because that's usually the best indicator of somebody's value system. So generosity is very much what Proverbs advocates. So my next discussion point is, should generosity begin with my family and friends? And if you get time, which poor do we give to and how? I was going to say a question like, you know, given our current welfare system, is giving to the poor obsolete? If you get through those very quickly, but you've only got 7 minutes and 6 seconds. So see how you go. Okay, we'll come back together again. That first question is a little bit loaded. If you are familiar with the news, you'll have heard a few months ago a certain world leader talking about the hierarchy of giving. He pointed us back to our Bibles and said we should be aware that the Bible teaches that you give to your family first, then your community, then your country, and then if you've got anything left, to the rest of the world. And then they withdrew lots of funding for the rest of the world. So it is a bit loaded, but it does ask the question, doesn't it, about, you know, where do we give our money, and how do we do it? Let's just move on then. So we've got two kind of thoughts thus far in Proverbs. It's where do you get money from, and the Bible, you know, the Proverbs is very clear, and the Bible is very clear that there are certain places where you don't get money, so you don't steal, you don't exploit, and you do get through hard work. And then it talks about what you do, and the general rule is generosity. You know, if in doubt, give. And you know, my rule of thumb is don't make judgments. You know, if I'm walking past the guy that's begging at Asda, I don't really want to means test him. I don't want to question his motives. You know, I don't want to know whether he's going to drink it all away. I'll just give. I told you a bit ago that there's a guy that always begs outside Asda, and as I walked past, he said to me, "Hey, can you give us something?" I said, I'll buy you a sandwich. Thank you. Can you get me a meal deal? I can get you a meal deal. Can you get me Diet Coke? Yeah, I'll get you Diet Coke. But I don't want to means test somebody, you know. I just want to be generous, and if somebody tells me that I'm adding to somebody's pain or whatever, so be it. But then the third aspect is, and I think this is perhaps one of the most fundamental things about money, is what does it do to you? You know, it's not just about where did you get it from and how are you giving it. It's what does it do to you? And I wasn't due to speak this evening. Sam was going to come, but he's preaching elsewhere. And he sent me his notes, and I like this idea Not that this isn't his notes, by the way. I have done some work on this. I planned my lesson carefully. But I like this phrase about playing with fire, because wealth is playing with fire. Because whether you like it or not, it does things to you. And so you have to be aware of it. And I know you're probably sat there thinking, well, could I just have some money and just see how it goes? Could I give it a chance? But it is playing with fire. So let me tell you 3 things that money does. So these are my 3 warnings. First of all, it gives you power over other people. Secondly, it makes us independent of God. And the third thing, it gives us an unhealthy view of our status and panders to our egos. So there are 3 dangers. First of all, is power. And you have to be so careful. I was conscious, when I was a head teacher, that I had power. And just making sure that I conducted myself in a way that glorified God, and that I often didn't like that power. I often still to this day don't like the concept of power. I like to give it away. I like not to have power. One of the challenges, so let's have a look at the next. So Proverbs remind us, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. Now, when we read Proverbs, it's not always about establishing principles, it's often just observations. So the writer of the proverb is not necessarily saying that it has to be that way, but what he's saying is, I've observed, and this is how it is. And there is no doubt that the wealthy have power. So if you have wealth, by definition, that brings a certain power. And the question is, how are you going to use it? The second thing is around the way that wealth makes us independent of God. And as you get older, as I am now, I can look back and I can see certain things. I can remember when certain countries where communist regimes toppled and capitalist regimes came in, and everybody was so excited. And it's like, we've got rid of that horrible oppressive thing, and now we've got the free market, and we've got capitalism, as though, we should have been saying hallelujah. And I just remember thinking, but my experience is that sometimes when people get wealth, they have no place of God anymore. And many of us, if you actually look at your friendship groups, many of us will have friends who at some point were really on fire for Jesus, particularly in their youth. And you remember looking up to them and thinking, if only I could be like them. And then as they became successful at work and wealthy and influential, they had no need for God anymore. And so they became independent. And I know this is from Jeremiah, not Proverbs, but I just think my people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they have dug their own systems, broken systems that cannot hold water. And that's what wealth does. It's a broken system. You think it holds life, but it holds nothing. That's right. And so the challenge for us is making sure that our wealth doesn't make us independent of God and get us to that place where we have no need of him anymore. And then the final thing is around power, and it's also around esteem. A lot of us have quite delicate egos, and we just, like it or not, we love a bit of status. We love a bit of praise. We love a bit of, it appeals to our flesh, and that we are somebody and we have something. It's that kind of thing, where the wealthy walk into a restaurant and they say, oh, could I have that table by the window? And they say, oh, I'm sorry, sir, that's booked. And then they get £100 out of their pocket and put it down and say, is it booked now? it is for you, sir. And then you go, you know, it's about status, and it's about, you know, that ego that it brings. And we need to really guard against it, because what God's expecting you to do is not to inflate your ego. He's expecting you to give it away. He's expecting you. And I think, Duncan, you mentioned about left hand and right hand. Many of you will know Bev's mum and dad. I used to love their left hand and right hand not knowing. In fact, her mum and dad didn't know each other in terms of what they were doing. I remember Luke coming home once and he said, I've had a lovely time. And he'd walked into their house, and they were really stereotypical of people of that generation. Marjorie was in the kitchen baking. Grandad was in the front room watching Test match cricket. That's how it was. Luke walked in and Grandma hugged him. He went into the front room and Grandad shook his hand. But Luke tells me, he said you'd walk in and Grandma'd hug you, and then she'd go to a person and she'd say, Luke, there's £50 there, but don't tell your Grandad. So he'd say, oh, thanks, Grandma, put it in his pocket. He'd walk into the front room, Grandad would go to his wallet and he'd say, there's £50. Don't tell Grandma. Left hand and right hand not knowing what each other was doing. And I love that concept. You know, I love that concept of secrecy. That's why I sometimes struggle, if I'm being honest, with WhatsApp. And, you know, churches, I can't imagine how many WhatsApp groups I'm part of. And they're an essential part of church administration, because you need to know stuff. But what you have to guard against is that WhatsApp becomes a platform for you announcing what you've been doing. You know, that rather than just, you know, because sometimes our motives are not what they seem. So when I'm telling people stuff, I need to guard against, and I can speak from a sense of, because I don't ever post anything on WhatsApp in any group, so I'm the best example of it all. I don't ever use it for that mechanism, but I do sometimes wonder when I'm watching a WhatsApp group, that sort of self-aggrandizement that just wants everybody to know. And then what do? I say, oh, by the way, Jess, that was so sacrificial. Thank you, dear brother. You know, and I just think we have to be careful that we don't pander to our egos. And it's the same with money. What money does, it gives us power, it makes us independent, and it just panders to that sense of, I want people to know. So my final little thing for you is, I want you to imagine that you're talking to a wealthy Christian, and they tell you, and they quote the Bible, which is always good, isn't it? If you want to justify your behaviour, quote the Bible. They quote the proverb that says, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. So, a rich person uses this to justify their wealth. How would you respond? And then an extension is, if you get there, is how do we marry the teaching of Proverbs to what Jesus was saying? And I actually think they're not in opposition. I think there is some synergy, but you just have to unpick that. So you've got 9.8, which is 9 minutes and 48 seconds, is it? Yep, off you go. Okay, we're going to bring that sort of conversation to an end. Just for clarity, the timing just were there to make me laugh rather than for any other reason, so just ignore those. I'm going to hand over to Alison, but I just wondered if anybody had heard something from somebody else that they thought, that has really made me think. So but the rule is, if you said it, you can't repeat it. If you've heard it, you can't attribute it. But if you've heard it, you can tell us. So has anybody, just in the last few seconds that I've got, anybody hear anything that they thought, yeah, that has really made me think this evening? Wow. I'm going to do another one on wisdom and see if we can get some. No, that's okay. But it's worth just kind of mulling over those three things about where do we get money from, what do we do with it. But if I could give you anything from this evening, I'd like you to take away that final thought, which is what does it do to you? Because that to me is at the heart. And I'm a bit indifferent about, if we had a vote and I said, are you anti-Christians and wealth? Whether we had a show of hands. I'm a bit indifferent, to be quite honest. But I am concerned because I do believe that Christians and wealth is playing with fire. Now that's okay if you're a fire eater, but the rest of us need to take care.